that the person who took their life now has created a scenario where eventually the survivor is going to be angry that they took that action as the ultimate action to my trespasses, to my failures, to my inconsistencies, to my fallenness, etc. That answer was the bad, wrong answer, and we get mad at that you didn't have to do that. Look what there's that sense of, I'm mad at you for doing that. You shouldn't have done that. You hurt everybody. You hurt yourself. And so the anger comes out that way.
The American Foundation for Suicide has this on one of their posters. Every 15 minutes, someone in the United States dies by suicide. Every 16 minutes, someone is left to make sense of it. Now, in this episode, I want to turn our attention to the people who are left to make sense of the suicide death of someone close to them, the family and the individual loved ones who will be affected for the rest of their lives. The question I'm asking today is this: how can we, if the occasion ever fell to us, help those people in their grief? What can we do or say that will somehow give them strength and genuine hope? And to that end, I have called upon my friend of over 40 years, Larry Enriquez. He is an extraordinarily empathetic, gifted, and wise counselor who in his long career has helped thousands of people deal with the severest forms of grief and loss. It's my strategy and hope that by listening closely to his story and his experiences, we might learn something that can help us help others.
You're listening to a small good thing.
Good thing.
Small good thing with Steve Zelt.
I'm Steve Zelt. This show was recorded shortly after the suicide deaths of Anthony Bourdain and Kate Spade. In the media, there followed once again a cultural discussion of what are the social causes or the psychological complexities and maybe the possible preventions of suicide. And all of those things are extremely vital discussions. But I'm not going to focus on those things in this program. What I want to try to focus on are those who are left behind, those who are now having to live with the lasting consequences of the dramatic and traumatic decision of someone else. I find myself, again, talking to a person who has many identities and has played many roles. Larry Enriquez was ordained as a minister in 1979. However, he by no means remained cloistered in some sort of imaginary safe space behind church walls. Over the course of years, partly by design and partly by providence, if you believe in that sort of thing, he became a very public man. One thing that happened was that, along with his pastoring duties, he became the executive director of a YMCA. For 14 years there, he actively shaped the programs for young people and families. And consequently, because of his leadership position there, he also became more and more acquainted and involved with local business and government leaders, so much so that he eventually left his post with the Y to act as the chief of staff for San Bernardino County Supervisor Gary Ovitt for 4 years. And there's one more thing that's pertinent to our subject today. Early on, Larry decided to become a ride-along police chaplain with the Ontario Police Department. Larry is a man acquainted with death and grief. In his vocation as a pastor, he naturally has buried hundreds of people. Often he has been with them in their final hours. But as a ride-along police chaplain, he has seen death in a very different way. Violent death, death by accident, death by murder and manslaughter, and death by suicide. In these situations, it is Larry, in his role as a police chaplain, who, more often than not, will be one of the first persons to talk to the stricken survivors of such violence. And as you might imagine, being so intimately involved with such traumatic situations has left a mark on him. Several times in our conversation on his patio one summer night a few weeks ago, he had to pause because he was overcome with a memory or an event. I'm wondering if you can remember how and why you became a police chaplain at first, and if you can just tell us a little bit about what a police chaplain does.
Well, yeah, I do remember it. And Steve, first of all, I don't think I was an executive director of the Y yet. I was pastoring the church that met at the Y, and I was doing counseling work there at the Y at an office that I had there, and I was counseling people in and out of the school district and the police department and blah blah blah. But there was connection to the police department, which for this show doesn't really matter, but that connection was as such that they said, your connection to police, my family connection was as such, maybe you should consider being a chaplain since you're a pastor. Back in the day, it was a kind of a loose description. You had to be ordained and you had to be part of a staff somewhere. There was an in-depth background check, those kinds of things. But there really wasn't a good description of it other than I was being called to assist victims and police officers when tragedy would strike and or situations that demanded some kind of intervention. But nowadays, municipalities and police departments are tied up with agencies that bring first responders, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc., to the field. But in those days, it was a chaplain who did. I did that, and so I didn't really understand that. I just felt that would be really cool to have a badge. Because she said, you'll get a badge and everything in a uniform. And I thought that it really was kind of a fun idea. Back in those days, I was a little more athletic and I liked running around. I thought I could even play cop or whatever it was I was thinking. I don't remember completely, but I ended up going to a police academy and getting some certifications that way so that I could be a certified chaplain, a judicial chaplain. I thought at that point in my life, it's good to just, whatever you can, explore it, do it, get certified in it, just experience life. I remember when I was in seminary that, our teacher at the time said, Larry, you always told me, said, you need to go hook up with an ambulance company and just kind of ride an ambulance, kind of see how life is. I didn't take him up on that, but his thing to me was you need to just go experience humanity in its kind of brokenness and kind of its real life, where the rubber's meeting the asphalt. But if I knew that if I knew that meant I was going to begin to relationally become engaged with people who were suffering, hurting, grieving, in despair, in trauma, I would have said, heck no. I would have said no. Because you enter into the grief of another, and that's hard work. It doesn't feel good. There's a personal pain that comes with that when you enter into grief with somebody. You experience their pain. I'm trained to understand what it means to keep a crime scene clean. So not to dirty it, how do I minister or serve the grieving people who are only going to be seeing the cold, technical side of the incident if I'm not there to assist, or another officer or somebody else to assist them with their emotional and relational despair. And we have a great police department that is concerned about the human being. They could just say, be cold and not say, hey, they can handle that themselves. But in this case, in these cases, we have a police department that is concerned about the human being and provides chaplains like myself who are there on scenes to help people negotiate the pain they're going through, at least to be there to help them at some level. In fact, it wasn't too long ago that a mother was with her teenage son, or a 20-year-old son, and their car breaks down in the road, and the son gets out to push the mom in the car to the side, and as he's doing that, a car comes and hits him from the back and keeps going, and she's not sure. She just gets a jolt and kind of is a little confused and gets out looking for her son, and she thinks he's run somewhere because the car was coming and can't find it, doesn't realize that the guy's dragged her son around the corner before he stops and tries to get away. He's dead. So I'm meeting with her on the road, and I say, I really apologize because there's a lot of technicalities that we have to go through in order to get the person who's murdered your son. But I want to talk to you about other things. I want to Sorry. I want to protect them. Yeah. I want them to know that, and I don't really know them, usually, but I want them to feel cared for. All of us, as we go through life, we go, oh, I wish somebody cared for me, or at any given moment, and I know that sense of, and when they're at that stage, I can only imagine what they might feel like. And so I think they feel like they look like that. They look scared, they look alone, they look vulnerable, they look weak, all those things. And those aren't demeaning things. It's just a state of that. And so I want to engage in such a way that they feel protected and not alone, and not that no more injury is going to come, at least not tonight, at least not today. That's what I do. Try to help them understand what's going on so that they understand that there's a purpose behind what they see as being a coldness. I'm older and I cry easy, Steve. That's just how it goes.
When you meet for the first time the survivors of someone who has taken their life or suffered some other form of violent death, what do you do? What do you say to them?
If my audience in this conversation at this point is the survivors, the family members, etc., around the table, I don't say much. I just try to connect with them in a visceral way. If it's not out of line, I'll hold their hand, I'll draw them close, I'll give them a hug, I'll put my head close to their head. There is a sense of trying to engage with the person who now is left. There are natural stages of grief, and they're some of them are more angry than others. Some are still denying, I can't believe it, and they have that sense of denial, and some feel guilty. But those are all things they'll go through eventually anyway. Any one of those things. So it depends where they're at, but generally speaking, they're in a daze. There's a wonderful thing I believe God has given us in our bodies that kind of give us a kind of an anesthetizing kind of effect to go through that. And then as that wears off and it becomes more real, we become a little more introverted and a little more lonely and a little more contemplative of the guilt that we have somehow contributed to the death, or we think negatively. The pain of the loss and the way that loss has occurred creates a smallness to us. So I try to give them breath and life and perspective by having them talk, and me talking to them about what's really happened and the condition of the person, what they may have been thinking or what they may have been feeling, and how they're not in control of that, what they're responsible for, what they're not responsible for. Every situation is different, but talking and conversing about the person and their place in this person's life is important because it gives them a sense of perspective. I have a perspective, I have a worldview, and I want to inject to them as much as I can the truth that I believe is present in that there's a God who sees and who knows and who loves and who's present, and that we can find strength there from him. And generally, Steve, just so you understand, before I talk a lot about what I think I know or how I can guide them, etc., I let them talk a lot. I ask them questions. Tell me about so-and-so. How long, how this and that, what was the relationship to you? If it's a child, tell me about his birth. Tell me about his life. I let them talk to me. All pain is to make us, in one sense, smaller, concentrating on that painful thing, whatever that is. If I were to pinch you right now, it's hard for you to concentrate other than on the pain in that one area. So pain kind of has this way of kind of sucking the energy to where the pain source is. So whatever, whether it's psychological pain or whether it's physical pain or mental pain or, well, psychological pain, emotional pain, relational pain, it can take us and suck the life out of us, and that becomes the focus of life. That becomes everything, because pain has a nature to do that, to make us disappear into the pain. So we have to fight that. We have to get outside of that and get perspective, because you can lose perspective by the nature of pain. We have to keep moving forward. And you want to help people move forward through their stages of guilt and shame and hurt and pain. You don't want them sitting in that mess for too long. By the way, Steve, can I interject just real quickly, because I don't want you to be disconnected from this reality that even though I would not have chosen this job, I mean, not just as a chaplain, but just as a human being or a pastor or a counselor, to enter into the grief of others, I feel a little more honored. I have a different perspective on that now. And I don't feel so scared to enter into the grief of somebody else. I feel honored to do that. And it's hard, but the more I've subjected myself to the reality of that and the pain of it, the more it's not so bad. It kind of like comes, and then I can let some of that stuff go. Some stuff you can't let go. I mean, we live in a wounded world, a hurting world, and that's just part of our predicament, and I can live in joy in the midst of that. But I realize that that's the world I live in, and I'm not afraid to enter into the grief of somebody else like I used to be. I'm not sure fear is the word, but the angst that was behind that. Oh, I got to go enter into that grief. Here I go. I don't feel that so much anymore. I feel a little more on the honored side. I've always been honored to do that, but I feel less fear about it, or less personal pain about it.
You know, one thing I was curious about was how people who were not religious received or didn't receive you as a chaplain, someone who clearly thinks that God has something to say about death. I wonder, too, if you haven't frequently met people who were angry at God, possibly believing that he was somehow to blame for the horrendous tragedy. Did non-believing people ever reject you?
Well, I try to get a sense of where they're at religiously. My intent is not to pound them over with, believe what I believe. But if I get a sense of where they're at, then I can talk to where they're at. But I've not really ever experienced much resistance, ever, really. I think they want to believe in something outside of themselves. They want to believe in something that's supernatural, something that's beyond this very ugly natural thing. And so they're open to hear the comfort. And frankly, the Bible's true and good and lovely. And I think that when you speak those things to a person, when you say them, that they bring life to people. They brings fresh air to people. And some you mentioned that some people may be mad at God. I understand that, so I already address that in advance. I'll speak to them about the responsibility of human beings and that sin's in the world and brokenness is in the world, but God is there to help us if we give our lives to Him, and if we can find a way to look for His strength, that He can strengthen. But we can choose outside of that. That we have free will, and we can choose evil, we can choose brokenness, we can choose crime, whatever, so that they understand that man has free will, and that God has given man that free will, and that sometimes that free will is deadly. But yeah, I've never encountered anything over my years that has resisted that.
I'd like you to talk for a little bit about the long-term effects of suicide on the survivors. You've mentioned the grieving process of having to deal with the anger and guilt and depression that frequently, if not always, accompanies the survivors. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that. What kind of guilt and anger do survivors of suicide experience? What could they possibly be angry at?
Ultimate expression of the deceased response to life, and I'm part of that life, or that survivor is part of that life. That the person who took their life now has created a scenario where eventually the survivor is going to be angry that they took that action as the ultimate action to my trespasses, to my failures, to my inconsistencies, to my fallenness, etc. That answer was the bad, wrong answer, and we get mad at that you didn't have to do that. Look what there's that sense of, I'm mad at you for doing that. You shouldn't have done that. You hurt everybody. You hurt yourself. And so the anger comes out that way. It's a combination of guilt and anger. And anger sometimes comes up as a protective mechanism, because when I'm angry, the sense of anger kind of protects me in a sense, right? And that's what anger does. It kind of keeps, my neck veins pop out, and I feel, like I can protect myself, true or not. There's that sense of self-protection with anger, and so anger sometimes masks the guilt. Guilt makes us feel vulnerable. They make mistakes, some intentional, some not intentional, and in their relationship to the person who has taken their lives, they have said things that are not that were not healthy or the best for them. They were not always constructive. They may even, at some point or another, contributed to their pathology of demise. They might have said something that but we don't know that. The fact is, we're fallen, and when somebody takes their life, those things are what come up in people's lives. They go, I didn't say this, I didn't do that, or I should have did that, and I realize, well, that anger begins to turn in towards themselves, and it comes out in this depressive kind of state. And so anger sometimes takes the place of guilt, or guilt becomes anger because I feel more protected and less vulnerable. At some point, I will say to the survivor, what was so-and-so so mad at? What was he or she so mad about? And when somebody is talking to me at a level where they're contemplating it, I will ask them that too. Go, why are you so angry? What are you so mad about? That you would want to hurt so many people, that you'd want to do this in such a way that you will now leave this on them until the day that they die. What have they done to you? So that just starts conversation to talk about greater or deeper things. Again, my thing, I believe, the healthy thing for them is to find some sense of perspective when the pain is making them all so small. And it's appropriate. At some point, you can't get out of that. But at the same time, you want some air in there. Does that make sense? Some breath. You want perspective. You don't want them to spiral down into this dark, despairing thing. You want them to see truth, which is more than just what's happened in front of them. There's a whole other kind of thing that's going on. And you want to help people move forward through their stages of guilt and shame and hurt and pain. You don't want them sitting in that mess for too long.
You've seen a lot of bad stuff, way more than the rest of us, the average person, is ever going to see in their whole life. And I'm kind of wondering if you'd be willing to talk a little bit about how that's affected you and how you've dealt with that.
There's a humanity that's in pain and in hurt, and we tend to see that more times than not. But and so at different seasons of our lives, of my life, that has affected me in ways that that's hard to articulate, really. I mean, it's just like something quirky happens. You just feel more sad, or you feel a little more stuck, in a mood that you go, oh, where's this coming from? And you have to work through that. And then, but what I've done, Steve, is that I preach. And so the nature of preaching is as such that I can articulate my own pain, my own faults. I find the truth in the scriptures, and I can articulate it in a way that allows me to preach to myself. I preach to myself. I have preached sermons before. I'm thinking, where I feel like I'm being literally healed by my own words. That God holds all things in His hands, and all things are under His watch, and the worst things aren't the worst things. God sees them, and God has remedy, and God has redemption, and God has a plan outside of mine. And though there's a life I can't control outside of me, that God is in control outside of me. So that's important. The other thing is God has given me people who love me in my fallen condition. You know, I have a lovely wife who loves me. I feel loved by her. And children who love me. I was going through some things, and a doctor friend of mine said, those are PTSD symptoms. Why don't you talk to so-and-so? And I talked to so-and-so, and he did some therapy with me, and it was helpful. It was hard, but it helped me work through that. So I did go through some post-traumatic stress syndrome, but I feel better for it. But I want to say what all of us can do is that we can talk. We can learn to talk, learn to try to express what you feel. I have my ways of doing that. Preaching is one of them. Talking to friends and talking to my wife, who's sometimes going, oh my gosh, Larry, stop, you know. But I talk. Some people don't talk so well, but try it. Spew it out. Find somebody who will listen to you.
Nobody sees your smile.
You know, there's something I haven't told you, and that's that Larry is also, among all these things, a singer-songwriter. I'm going to play one of his songs, but after that, I have asked him to say one last thing to close the show.
Behind your mirrored glass, and by the hand he pulls you to the dance floor, and with his body begins to dance, and your body has no rhythm. You can hardly even stand, and with his eyes piercing your face, and with his eyes piercing your face, so begins the dance of grace. Oh, your house, it stands in clutter, and your rooms, they sit in mess, and your doors you will not open to the love of any guest.
Larry, thanks for being on. If you had just one chance, one shot at saying something to somebody right now who maybe is listening and is maybe struggling even now to cope with the suicidal death of someone close to them, what would you want them to know?
Yeah, you're imperfect. You have a lot of flaws. And you can try to control those things in such a way that you can change and be transformed to be a better person. But you can only do that. You cannot be responsible for the person who took their life. That is not your responsibility, never has been, never would be. That's their responsibility. And your greatest effort now, or I should say your greatest sense of being now, is to take responsibility for only moving forward. Move forward. Because you can control that. Be more loving, more forgiving to yourself. Grow. Find a way to grow. Don't stay stuck in somebody else's decision that you really could never have controlled, even though you think you could have. You could not. It is not your responsibility. Yours is now to grow, change, transform, go forward. Find a way to do that.
And your doors you will not open.
I hope you've heard some small good thing today, maybe something that might be good for someone else too. If you know someone who might benefit from listening to this episode, why not send them a link to the show? And speaking of links, there are lots of links in the program description, including links to Larry and his music, as well as links to the very talented artists whose music is featured between the segments, Whispers by Hyson and Of Elias Dream by Ben Sound. And finally, if you would like to support this show, one easy way to do that is to subscribe to it. Thanks for listening.
And with his eyes piercing your face, and so begins the dance of grace.